Tonight, we are drifting off into one of the most dramatic chapters Earth has ever written. 200 million years ago, our planet was ruled by giants. For more than 100 million years, vast bodies moved through forests, across floodplains, along shorelines that seemed as permanent as the sky itself. Life followed patterns that felt unbreakable, rhythms repeated for countless generations, until one day something arrived from space. We've all heard the version passed down so often it feels complete. An asteroid struck the Earth, firestorms followed, darkness spread, and the dinosaurs disappeared. That story isn't wrong, but it doesn't tell us everything. The impact did more than scorch the surface and fill the air with ash. It struck a planet that is mostly water, with a force so great that the Earth itself shifted in response. The ground did not simply tremble, the crust flexed. Energy raced outward, reaching oceans far beyond the crater. When something hits Earth with that kind of force, oceans do not stay still. Water lifts, it spills, it moves. Seas were pushed beyond their familiar boundaries. Coastlines lost their shape, not as one towering wave, but as repeated surges that arrived again and again, each one compounding the last. Lowlands filled, rivers failed. Landscapes that had been stable for millions of years began to soften, sink, and disappear beneath water and settling sediment. Flooding was not a side effect of the impact, it was a response. In the final chapter of the dinosaur world, water became one of the most destructive forces at work. Tonight, we'll ease our way back toward that distant moment. But before we begin, if this gentle journey is already easing your thoughts, you're in the right place. A soft tap on the like button or a quiet subscription helps this little corner of calm continue to exist, and it means more than you might think. And if you're feeling cozy, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. It's always comforting to see how far these quiet stories travel. So now, take a deep breath, let your thoughts grow soft, and together let us drift into the great flood that rewrote the final chapter of the age of dinosaurs. At the close of the Cretaceous, the Earth wore a different outline than the one we know today. Continents rested in unfamiliar positions, separated by broad waters and softened edges, their shapes unfinished and gently provisional. Land did not rise sharply from the sea, it eased into it. Coastlines wandered inland for vast distances, forming wide margins where water and earth met without clear borders. The planet appeared open, exposed, and unusually receptive to change. Much of what looked like solid ground was already threaded with water. Shallow inland seas spread quietly across continents, pooling in basins and lowlands that had formed over immense spans of time. These seas were not narrow channels or temporary floods. They were expansive, stable features of the world, warm and shallow, pressing deep into places that now lie far from any ocean. Forests, floodplains, and nesting grounds often existed only a gentle rise above these waters, sustained by a balance that felt steady but required little to disturb it. The edges of the continents were long and low, stretching outward beneath the sun in gradual slopes rather than steep drops. Beaches extended for hundreds of miles. Coastal plains blended into wetlands, marshes, and tidal flats. There were few abrupt barriers between dry land and the sea. Movement between them was slow and continuous, shaped by tides and seasons rather than sudden change. Life adapted to this softness. Dinosaurs fed, nested, and migrated along these broad margins, following routes shaped by water that was always close, always present. Sea levels during this time were already high, higher than most periods before or since. Much of the planet's water rested above today's familiar shoreline, spread thinly but widely across the continents. The land existed in a delicate equilibrium, its lowest regions held just above inundation by subtle differences in elevation. Valleys were shallow, plains were broad and flat, drainage was slow and sprawling, winding gently toward nearby seas that never felt distant. From above, the world would have appeared calm and expansive, a mosaic of water and land interlaced rather than divided. Oceans reached inward with patience, while continents extended outward without resistance. The geography of the planet favored connection over separation. It was a world where water had already claimed much of the surface, leaving land exposed not as a fortress, but as a thin skin stretched between seas. This arrangement was not a flaw or an anomaly, it was simply the state of the earth at that moment in deep time, stable, familiar, and quietly vulnerable. Long before any sudden change arrived, the planet had shaped itself into a form that could be easily overwhelmed, not through weakness, but through openness. The boundaries that defined land and sea were wide, low, and forgiving, awaiting only enough force to be crossed. The architecture of the planet played a quiet role long before any sudden change arrived. Beneath the calm surface of the oceans, continental shelves stretched outward like submerged plains, broad and gently sloping rather than steep or abrupt. These shelves were shallow, wide, and expansive, extending far from the edges of the continents before descending into deeper basins. Water resting on them existed in a state of balance that depended more on surface area than depth, spread thinly across vast spaces, sensitive to movement rather than resistant to it. In such shallow seas, water could not sink downward to absorb disturbance. It had nowhere to go but outward. When energy entered these systems, it traveled laterally, not vertically, pushing across the surface instead of dissipating below. The geometry of the shelves transformed motion into displacement. What might have been muted in deeper oceans became amplified here, translated into sweeping movement across enormous distances. The wider the shelf, the farther the water could travel before losing momentum. Large volumes of water behave differently when suddenly energized. They do not rise into isolated peaks and vanish. They spread, flatten, and surge, carrying their momentum forward. Energy passes through them as rolling motion rather than sharp impact, producing broad pulses instead of single walls. These pulses interact with the shape beneath them, climbing gently sloped seabeds with ease, moving inland almost without resistance. The absence of steep underwater barriers allowed water to maintain speed and coherence, gathering force as it traveled. The continents themselves offered little interruption. Much of the land nearest these seas was low and open, shaped by long periods of sediment accumulation rather than uplift. Plains extended outward with minimal elevation change, forming natural corridors for moving water. These regions were not carved by deep valleys or protected by high ground. They were built flat, expansive, and exposed, shaped by rivers that wandered rather than cut sharply, and by coastlines that shifted gradually over time. Many dinosaur ecosystems developed within this narrow vertical margin between land and sea. Forests, floodplains, nesting grounds, and migration routes often existed only slightly above prevailing water levels. Productivity favored these spaces because water, nutrients, and warmth collected there naturally. Life flourished along edges and in transition zones, where stability seemed assured, precisely because change had always been slow. Elevation offered no warning, only continuity. Once disturbance occurred, this arrangement left few buffers. Water energized across shallow shelves met landscapes already prepared to receive it. Motion translated seamlessly from sea to land, from shelf to plain, from ocean basin to interior. Flooding did not require exceptional conditions to advance. It followed the design already in place, guided by the shape of the planet itself. This was not coincidence or fragility. It was physics expressed through geography, a world built with wide shelves, shallow seas, and low continents naturally transformed sudden energy into widespread inundation. When movement finally began, the outcome was already embedded in the structure of the Earth. At first, the change did not announce itself with surface chaos, deep beneath sky and sea. The planet absorbed a sudden transfer of energy that moved faster than sound, faster than weather, faster than fire. The impact did not simply strike the ground, it pressed into the earth, forcing rock to behave briefly like fluid, allowing energy to radiate outward through the crust in expanding waves. Stone carried that motion efficiently. Shock traveled through bedrock as compression, spreading laterally across continents and beneath oceans. The planet flexed as a single, connected body, passing energy along faults, layers, and boundaries that had formed over billions of years. This was not vibration in place, but movement through structure, a pulse that crossed the globe without regard for surface features. Long before heat reshaped the air or darkness gathered overhead, the Earth had already begun to respond internally. Where these waves reached the ocean basins, their behavior changed form but not intent. Energy entering water could no longer remain confined. Unlike rock, water could not hold compression in place. It translated force into motion immediately, spreading it outward across its surface. The oceans reacted not because they were struck directly, but because they were connected to what was. The seafloor lifted and fell in subtle but immense motions, transferring momentum upward into the water above. Water responded faster than atmosphere or climate because it required no transformation to act. Air needed heat to rise, climate needed time to shift, water needed only movement. The instant the ground beneath it changed position, even slightly, the mass of the ocean adjusted. Gravity ensured that adjustment could not remain local. Motion spread, distributing energy across entire basins in broad, low pulses that traveled freely along the surface. At planetary scale, ocean displacement was not a splash or a wave crest, it was redistribution. Trillions of tons of water were set in motion together, lifted where seafloor rose, displaced where it fell, and pushed outward across the shallow edges of continents. The surface of the sea tilted almost imperceptibly, yet across such vast distances, even a small change carried enormous consequence. Water sought equilibrium, and in doing so, began to move. This movement did not require visible violence to begin. It unfolded quietly, governed by physics that favored transfer over resistance. The shape of the ocean basins and continental margins guided it naturally, allowing energy to pass from solid earth into liquid without interruption. Motion gathered coherence as it traveled, spreading across shelves and shallows that offered little depth to absorb it. What mattered in this moment was not destruction, but connection. Rock, water, and gravity acted together, transforming sudden energy into organized motion. The atmosphere remained largely unchanged above, and life continued its routines for a short while longer. Beneath the surface, however, the planet had already committed itself to movement. The conditions for flooding were no longer hypothetical. They had been set in motion, carried silently by the physics of a struck world. The first movement reached the shores long before the planet settled into silence above. Across the edges of continents, the sea arrived not as a single rising line, but as a sequence of advancing surges that followed one another with relentless calm. These were not waves shaped by wind or weather, They were expressions of mass in motion, oceans responding to a shift that had already passed through stone and basin alike. Their scale exceeded anything preserved in human memory. Water rose from horizons that had always remained distant, advancing inland with a force drawn from the breadth of entire ocean basins. Yet, what arrived was not uniform. Each surge carried a slightly different character, shaped by the uneven contours of seafloor and coast. Some advanced as wide, low pulses that spread outward quietly. Others followed closely behind, reinforced by returning motion from elsewhere, stacking energy upon energy without pause. This complexity mattered. Instead of one catastrophic wall that broke and withdrew, the sea continued to reorganize itself at the margins of land. Water arrived, retreated partially, then returned again, each movement adjusting to what remained. Coastlines lost their coherence within hours. Beaches vanished first, then wetlands, then the low plains beyond. Trees and soil offered little resistance. The motion favored breadth over height, spreading laterally into every depression, following paths shaped long before by slow erosion and sedimentation. Within a short span of time, shorelines that had existed for millions of years no longer marked the boundary between sea and land. The distinction blurred under advancing water that carried with it fragments of the ocean floor. Sand, shell, and fine marine sediments traveled far beyond their usual limits, suspended within the surges and laid down wherever movement slowed. These materials did not settle delicately. They arrived mixed, layered, and out of place, coating inland terrain with the signature of the sea. Long after the surface quieted, this evidence remained. Layers of marine sediment rested deep within the continents, far beyond any shoreline that could have delivered them slowly. They filled low basins, covered floodplains, and settled against the remnants of terrestrial environments. The arrangement of these layers spoke not of gradual change, but of sudden transport, of water carrying the ocean inland and releasing it where motion finally eased. The timing of this arrival mattered as much as its force. These first waves reached coastlines within hours of the impact, while the atmosphere above was only beginning to change. Skies still held light. Temperatures had not yet fallen. Life continued briefly, unaware that the ground beneath familiar landscapes had already been crossed by the sea. This moment marked first contact, not the full story of flooding, but its opening movement. The oceans had stepped beyond their usual boundaries and left unmistakable traces behind. What followed would take time, repetition, and persistence, but the first arrival was enough to alter the shape of the world, setting new conditions into place before many understood what had begun. Movement followed shape rather than violence. After the first arrivals along the coasts, water continued inland along paths that had always existed quietly in the geography. It pressed forward, not as a sudden leap, but as a steady occupation, guided by low relief and gentle gradients that offered little resistance. The sea did not rush upward toward high ground. It spread sideways, filling space that sat only slightly above its reach. Low-lying continents allowed this advance to continue far beyond any recognizable shoreline. Plains that had once supported forests and herds began to accept water as a new surface condition. The transition was subtle at first. Soil darkened, hollows filled, and shallow channels widened until the distinction between river, marsh, and sea dissolved. Water extended across flat terrain with patience, claiming ground in broad sheets rather than narrow channels. As this expansion continued, many inland regions took on the character of temporary seabeds. Layers of water rested where dry land had existed for countless generations, deep enough to alter movement and shallow enough to carry light and debris. Sediment settled slowly through these new inland seas, blurring tracks and softening contours. What had once been solid ground became a shifting surface, neither fully land nor fully ocean, but something between. Habitats that had never been coastal found themselves transformed without warning. Places built around fresh water and vegetation suddenly lay open to marine influence. Saline water mixed into floodplains. Tides reached areas that had known only seasonal rivers. Dinosaurs accustomed to distance from the sea found themselves living at its edge, not through migration, but because the edge had come to them. Familiar routes bent and disappeared under shallow water, and territories shrank as the sea occupied their margins. This was not a single front advancing uniformly. Water followed every low passage simultaneously. Valleys, basins, and plains filled together, creating a patchwork of submerged and exposed ground that shifted with each movement. Some regions were overtaken quickly, others more slowly, depending on subtle changes in elevation that had once seemed insignificant. Over large areas, the shoreline ceased to exist as a line at all. It became a zone, wide and unstable, moving back and forth as water continued to redistribute itself. Flooding expanded beyond the coasts because the land invited it inward. The arrangement of continents favored connection rather than confinement. Once water crossed the initial boundary, nothing compelled it to stop. Drainage systems designed for slow flow could not reverse this movement. Rivers widened into corridors of intrusion. Basins collected and retained water instead of releasing it. The sea simply occupied the space made available to it. What mattered in this phase was reach, not depth. Water did not need to be deep to change the world it entered. Its presence alone redefined space, converting interior landscapes into extensions of the ocean. The geography of the dinosaur world shifted quietly under this expansion, as distance from the sea lost its meaning and the interior became something newly exposed. Water did not only arrive from the edges, it pressed inward through the arteries of the land itself. Rivers that had always gathered rain and carried it patiently toward the sea began to lose their sense of direction. Channels, shaped over deep time, found their gradients subtly altered, their mouths no longer free to release what they carried. Flow slowed, hesitated, then turned upon itself as outside pressure overcame the quiet pull that had guided it for ages. Geology preserves this moment with unusual clarity. Layers of sediment show currents running opposite their familiar paths, grains aligned against the slope that once defined them. Riverbeds record brief intervals of reverse transport, not as isolated accidents, but across wide regions at once. These traces speak of water arriving from downstream with greater force than anything coming from above. The ocean did not wait at the coast. It entered river systems directly, pushing inland through channels that had always welcomed movement, but never expected it to come from that direction. As salt water advanced upstream, freshwater systems lost their coherence. Rivers widened instead of flowing. Banks softened and collapsed as currents lost their focus. What had once been a steady conveyance became a zone of mixing and confusion where tidal motion replaced downhill certainty. Floodplains that relied on periodic overflow for renewal found themselves submerged continuously, cut off from the rhythms that sustained them. Nutrients dispersed too widely. Plants drowned where they stood. The land's internal circulation quietly failed. These floodplains had long acted as pathways, guiding movement across open terrain. Animals followed them during migration and seasonal change, trusting their openness and access to water. As they filled, these same spaces became traps. Shallow water spread without clear edges, masking deeper channels and soft ground beneath suspended sediment. Progress slowed, familiar crossings vanished. What had offered passage now held animals in place, surrounded by water that did not drain away. Escape routes did not close suddenly. They thinned. Corridors narrowed as water occupied their lowest points first, then expanded outward with each adjustment of level. High ground grew isolated into islands of decreasing size. Connections between habitats broke one by one, not with noise or collapse, but through quiet separation. The sense of landscape continuity faded as movement required detours that no longer existed. The collapse of internal drainage completed the work begun at the coasts. Water no longer knew where to go, and neither did the systems shaped to guide it. Rivers ceased to be exits. They became conduits for intrusion, channels through which the sea redistributed itself deeper into the continents. Once this reversal took hold, recovery was no longer a matter of retreat. The land had lost its ability to empty itself. In this phase, flooding no longer depended on waves or surges, it sustained itself through imbalance. With every river compromised, every floodplain saturated, the interior of the continents accepted water faster than it could release it. The geography of flow had been rewritten, and the silence of that change carried farther than any single arrival of the sea. Life along the coasts had always thrived on abundance. Warm shallows supported dense plant growth, and rivers delivered nutrients that fed layered food webs. These regions hosted some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet, where dinosaurs nested, fed, and raised young in landscapes shaped by steady access to water. That same richness made them fragile when conditions shifted. Coastal dinosaurs were affected first, not because of weakness, but because of placement. Their lives were arranged around edges where land met sea, places that offered food, shelter, and predictable cycles. When water advanced beyond its usual bounds, it entered these systems immediately. There was no buffer, no gradual transition from one state to another. Nesting grounds laid down in low sands, and soils were submerged early, covered quietly by water that lingered rather than receded. Eggs suffocated in place. Seasonal patterns that had guided reproduction for generations ended without noise. Plants followed soon after. Many coastal forests and plains were adapted to periodic flooding, but not to saturation that did not drain. Roots deprived of oxygen failed silently. Leaves yellowed and fell, not from heat or ash, but from stillness beneath water. Entire stands of vegetation collapsed, while skies above remained unchanged. This loss arrived before firestorms or prolonged darkness could take hold, cutting away the primary source of energy that supported everything else. As plant life disappeared, the effects moved upward through the ecosystem with unsettling efficiency. Herbivores that relied on low-growing plants and soft shoots found their food gone or spoiled by salt and sediment. Grazing routes broke apart as water occupied the spaces between feeding grounds. Migration stalled, not through panic, but through absence. Carnivores followed these disruptions closely, not by choice, but because their prey thinned rapidly and unevenly. Food chains unraveled from the bottom upward. Insects vanished alongside the plants that fed them. Small animals lost shelter and forage. Each layer above responded to the loss below it, creating gaps that widened with time. The collapse did not require mass mortality at first. It required only interruption. Energy stopped flowing through familiar pathways, and balance failed to reestablish itself. What distinguished this phase was subtlety. These ecosystems did not vanish in dramatic collapse. They ceased to function. Reproduction failed quietly. Growth slowed and stopped. Interactions that had sustained life along the coasts for millions of years no longer aligned. Even animals capable of movement found themselves without the support systems that had once made those landscapes livable. By the time other global changes asserted themselves, many coastal ecosystems had already crossed a threshold. They were no longer whole. Their foundations had dissolved beneath shallow water and stalled drainage, leaving little for recovery to build upon. The first biological losses of the dinosaur world arrived not in fire or darkness, but in drowned roots, silent nests, and the quiet severing of food from life. Long after water crossed into places it had never occupied before, it began to carry something else with it. Floodwaters gathered the loose material of the land as they moved, lifting soil, sand, and fragmented rock into suspension. What had once rested quietly in riverbanks, coastal plains, and shallow seabeds now traveled together, held aloft by motion and spread across widening areas. The water itself became heavy, dense with the substance of the world it passed through. This weight changed the nature of flooding. As movement slowed across flat terrain, suspended material began to fall. Sediment did not settle evenly or gently. It arrived in pulses, thick clouds of particles dropping out of water almost at once. Layer after layer accumulated where flow weakened, blanketing surfaces that moments before had been navigable ground. In these conditions, burial became as dangerous as submersion. Air pockets vanished quickly. Limbs trapped beneath settling layers could not be freed before the weight above them increased. For animals caught within these advancing sheets of sediment, escape depended less on strength than on timing. The earliest layers were soft, but they hardened rapidly as more material settled on top. Each new deposit compressed the one beneath it, forcing water out and locking grains together. Movement slowed, then stopped entirely. Bodies became fixed in place, held by pressure rather than force. This process did not require deep water. Even shallow flood zones could entomb life completely when sediment loads were high and deposition was rapid. Burial also altered how death unfolded. Oxygen dwindled as fine particles sealed gaps within soil and vegetation. Respiration failed not from lack of air above the surface, but from its absence within the ground itself. Animals unable to rise or reposition found themselves enclosed by the very material that had once supported life. The distinction between land and sediment dissolved as surfaces liquefied and then solidified again. In some regions, this process repeated multiple times in succession. Water advanced, slowed, and released its load, then shifted again as new surges passed through. Each episode added thickness and complexity to the layers below. Bones, plants, and entire bodies were preserved not because conditions were peaceful, but because they were overwhelmed too quickly for decay or disturbance. Rapid coverage protected remains from scavengers and erosion, sealing them within stable environments almost immediately. These circumstances marked the beginning of fossilization while catastrophe was still underway. Chemical conditions within the sediment favored preservation as minerals infiltrated tissues and spaces left by decomposition. Shapes were retained, positions were fixed. The record of that moment was locked into stone even as the broader disaster continued to unfold across the planet. The weight of falling sediment transformed flooding into something final. Water might retreat or redistribute, but what it left behind remained. Thick deposits reshaped landscapes and erased surface detail, replacing living ground with layers that bore silent witness to what had been there before. In this phase of the collapse, extinction took on mass and form. Life was not only displaced or deprived, It was pressed into the earth itself, becoming part of the layers that still endure. Boundaries faded before structures collapsed. As water settled into new positions across continents, the familiar markers that once defined place and direction grew uncertain. Coastlines did not retreat or advance cleanly. They softened, stretched, and dissolved into wide zones where land and sea could no longer be separated with confidence. What had once been a clear edge became a shifting margin that moved subtly with each change in level. In this altered geography, land and water blended into a single unstable environment. Shallow sheets of sea covered plains, while higher ground rose like isolated shelves within a continuous surface. Islands formed where hills once stood, then narrowed as water redistributed itself again. The visual language of the world changed. Reflections replaced textures. Horizons flattened. Distance became difficult to judge when surfaces mirrored one another, and depth offered few clues. Animals that relied on spatial memory found themselves without reliable reference points. Migration paths, shaped by generations of repetition, ended abruptly where water interrupted them. Familiar routes disappeared beneath shallow flooding that concealed obstacles and erased landmarks. Orientation depended not only on sight, but on subtle gradients of terrain and vegetation that were no longer intact. When these cues vanished, movement lost its direction. Navigation failed quietly. There was no single moment of confusion, only an accumulation of small uncertainties. A bend in the land no longer led where it once had. A crossing widened into open water. High ground that had served as a guide stood isolated, surrounded by reflective surfaces that offered no clear approach. Even animals capable of swimming or wading encountered difficulty as currents shifted and footing dissolved beneath suspended sediment. For the planet as a whole, this was a liminal phase. It existed between states, no longer arranged as it had been, but not yet settled into what it would become. Water occupied spaces temporarily, but with enough persistence to redefine how those spaces functioned. The Earth entered a condition where orientation applied less to individual creatures than to the landscape itself. Directions that once held meaning no longer aligned with the surface. This instability affected more than movement. Social structures fractured as groups struggled to maintain cohesion across altered terrain. Seasonal cycles lost their spatial anchors. Breeding grounds, feeding areas, and refuges became difficult to locate or reach with consistency. Even without immediate physical threat, the loss of orientation strained survival in ways that accumulated over time. The absence of clear shores altered perception as much as reality. Without firm boundaries, the world appeared continuous and unresolved. Water stretched across sightlines that had once been broken by land. Sound traveled differently. Smell dispersed without familiar barriers. The sensory environment shifted in subtle ways that compounded confusion. In this state, the dinosaur world drifted, not through motion alone, but through uncertainty. The planet held land and sea in temporary balance, offering neither stability nor resolution. Orientation, once anchored to coastlines and contours, gave way to a geography in flux. The Earth moved through this passage without urgency, carrying life within a landscape that no longer pointed clearly in any direction. The water did not finish its work when the first movements passed. After the initial rearrangement, the oceans continued to shift, responding to imbalance that had not yet resolved. Across vast basins, the surface began to oscillate gently at first, then with growing reach, as energy reflected from boundary to boundary. These motions were not new waves arriving from elsewhere. They were echoes within the system itself, large-scale rocking that carried water back and forth across the planet. These oscillations unfolded as seiches, long-period movements that traveled through enclosed and semi-enclosed basins. Entire stretches of ocean rose and fell together, their timing set by distance and depth rather than by wind or storms. As one region lifted, another lowered, sending water sliding laterally across shelves and toward continental margins once more. The process was slow and deliberate, governed by physics that favored repetition until balance returned. For days, and in some regions far longer, water continued to slosh across the surface of the earth. Each cycle redistributed mass slightly differently, depending on how previous movements had altered the landscape. Sediment shifted, channels widened, basins deepened or filled. With every pass, the ground beneath the water changed shape, ensuring that the next movement would not trace the same path exactly. Flooding became rhythmic, arriving not as a single calamity, but as a series of returns. These returns mattered more than the first arrival. Areas that had drained partially were overtaken again. Regions that had remained barely exposed found themselves submerged after brief reprieve. Survival based on timing proved unreliable, as no clearing remained safe for long. Each surge encountered a landscape already weakened, already softened, and already stripped of many stabilizing features. What endured one movement often failed during the next. This persistence erased recovery almost as quickly as it began. Plants attempting to regrow were drowned again. Sediments freshly settled were lifted and redeposited elsewhere. Animal tracks vanished before they could lead anywhere useful. The environment reset repeatedly, never allowing conditions to stabilize. Flooding became not an event, but a state that the planet occupied intermittently, yet repeatedly. What made this phase distinctive was its quiet endurance. There was no single moment that marked its end. The oscillations diminished gradually as energy dispersed and water found new equilibrium. Until then, the earth remained in motion beneath an appearance of calm. Skies cleared in places, light returned. Yet the ground continued to change as water moved back and forth, erasing what little order had reformed. Each returning surge carried memory only of imbalance, not of what it replaced. The ocean did not recognize survivors or spared ground. It followed gravity and geometry alone, overriding landscapes without intent. In this way, flooding achieved its greatest reach, not through height or speed, but through time. Persistence ensured that what escaped once rarely escaped again, as the planet patiently completed the redistribution it had begun. Some waters did not withdraw when motion slowed elsewhere. In low basins and interior depressions, flooding settled into place and remained. These regions lay just far enough from dynamic coastlines and just deep enough to escape rapid rebalancing. Water pooled and stabilized, no longer driven by surges, yet not released by drainage. What formed were inland seas, quiet and persistent, held in place by geography rather than force. Where forests and plains had once stretched across open ground, broad sheets of water now rested without direction. There was no current to refresh them, no outlet to carry them away. Sunlight reached their surfaces, but movement beneath remained minimal. The land beneath softened and dissolved into suspension, blurring the boundary between soil and water. Vegetation that had survived initial flooding stood submerged, then collapsed, adding organic matter to an environment already deprived of circulation. Stagnation altered the chemistry of these waters quickly. With little mixing, oxygen near the surface failed to reach deeper layers. Decomposition accelerated as drowned plants and animals settled below. Microbial activity flourished in the stillness, consuming what oxygen remained. Conditions shifted towards scarcity without any visible warning from above. The water appeared calm, even stable, yet beneath that calm the ability to support life diminished steadily. Animals that entered or remained within these regions encountered a landscape that offered no immediate signal of danger. Shallow margins appeared navigable. The surface looked passable. Yet each step stirred fine sediment, releasing trapped gases and reducing oxygen further. Breathing grew difficult, not from exertion, but from environment. For many species, death arrived slowly, shaped by exhaustion and deprivation rather than trauma. This prolonged mortality distinguished inland seas from earlier phases of flooding. Here, survival was not determined by speed or strength, but by endurance in conditions that did not improve. There was no retreat of water to mark an end. Days stretched into weeks as these stagnant bodies persisted. Animals weakened gradually, losing the capacity to move or recover. Even those capable of swimming found no relief, as the entire volume of water shared the same depleted state. The biological impact extended beyond individuals. Populations caught within these regions declined steadily as reproduction failed and resources vanished. The absence of oxygen affected plants as deeply as animals, preventing regrowth even where light returned. Soil systems collapsed beneath prolonged saturation, erasing the possibility of recovery long after water levels stabilized. What had once been productive interior landscapes transformed into zones of slow, sustained loss. Inland seas that never left acted as quiet enclosures. They did not announce their presence with destruction, nor did they move on once damage was done. They lingered, altering time itself for the life caught within them. Extinction unfolded here as a drawn-out process, measured not in moments, but in the slow failure of bodies to persist. In these still waters, the dinosaur world continued to fade long after the louder movements of the planet had passed. Strength offered little protection once water became the dominant element. Many dinosaurs were immense, built for endurance across solid ground, supported by powerful limbs and mass that anchored them against wind and movement. That same mass became difficult to manage when the surface beneath them turned fluid. Water resisted every step, not as an obstacle to overcome briefly, but as a constant opposing force that demanded energy without return. Even animals capable of swimming were not suited for sustained travel in unstable conditions. Their bodies were heavy, their balance designed for land, not for prolonged flotation or maneuvering against shifting currents. Movement through water required continuous effort, and effort drew quickly on reserves already strained by disruption and lack of food. Muscles tired, coordination weakened, and progress slowed until forward motion barely exceeded the pull of the surrounding flow. Exhaustion arrived quietly. There was no sudden collapse, only diminishing ability to respond. Each attempt to wade or push onward required more energy than the last. Limbs met uneven resistance beneath the surface, stepping into soft sediment that gave way instead of supporting weight. Recovery grew difficult once an animal slipped or fell. Rising again demanded strength that water continuously drained away. The environment added hazards without intention. Floodwaters carried debris drawn from forests, riverbanks, and coastal plains. Branches, logs, stones, and fragments of vegetation moved within the flow, striking bodies that could not easily turn or retreat. Injuries accumulated from blunt force rather than predation. A damaged limb or broken joint did not heal in these conditions. It became a permanent disadvantage. further limiting movement and accelerating fatigue. Size intensified every difficulty. Large bodies displaced more water, increasing drag with every motion. Turning required space that shallow flooding did not always provide. Narrow passages filled quickly, leaving few routes that could accommodate bulk. Smaller animals could navigate around obstacles, slip through debris, or rest on floating material. Larger ones remained exposed, their mass keeping them submerged and vulnerable to constant resistance. There was no simple distinction between those that could swim and those that could not. What mattered was duration. Survival depended on how long an animal could continue moving before strength failed. The flooded landscape offered no clear refuge, only varying degrees of effort required to remain upright or afloat. Even brief rest increased risk as sediment shifted and water levels changed unpredictably. As energy waned, choices narrowed. Standing still conserved strength but invited entrapment as water deepened or sediment settled. Continued movement promised escape but demanded power that might not last. For many, the balance tipped gradually, not through panic, but through attrition. Bodies built for dominance on land met an environment that rewarded lightness, adaptability, and efficiency instead. This phase grounded the catastrophe in lived experience. Extinction here did not rely on sudden, overwhelming force. It unfolded through the limits of anatomy, meeting conditions they were never shaped to endure. Strength, once an advantage across plains and forests, became a burden in a world where water refused to yield. Long after water withdrew from the surface, the land retained its memory. Beneath later soils and stone, the ground preserved a record not written in flame or fracture, but in layers laid down quietly and all at once. Across continents, clusters of fossils began to appear where life had once been widespread, concentrated into places that spoke of transport, deposition, and sudden stillness rather than slow accumulation. These mass burial sites did not resemble the gradual remains of everyday death. Animals of different sizes and species lay together, aligned in ways that suggested movement before rest. Many were preserved where they fell, not scattered by scavengers or weathered by time. Flooding explained this pattern with restraint. Water gathered bodies and carried them only short distances before releasing them into low areas where sediment settled rapidly around them. The condition of preservation offered further insight. Skeletons remained articulated, with bones held in natural positions rather than separated or crushed. In some cases, impressions of skin, muscle outlines, and fine structural details endured. Such lifelike preservation required swift coverage and limited exposure. Sediment arrived quickly enough to protect remains from decay, sealing them within stable environments almost immediately. This was not the work of slow burial over seasons. It was the mark of sudden encapsulation. Within the layers themselves, direction became visible. Grains of sand and silt aligned consistently, revealing the path water had taken as it crossed the land. Fine laminations alternated with coarser deposits, recording shifts in flow strength and duration. These patterns did not form through still settling alone. They reflected moving water, surging and slowing, carrying its load and releasing it in pulses. Each layer captured a moment within a broader sequence of inundation. The vertical stacking of these sediments showed repetition rather than singularity. Deposits overlapped and interleaved, suggesting multiple episodes of transport and settling. Between layers, little evidence of recovery appeared. Soils did not reform. Root systems did not return. The intervals between movements were brief, insufficient for the land to re-establish its surface character. Flooding returned again and again, and the ground accepted each arrival without interruption. What made this testimony powerful was its quietness. There was no sign of struggle recorded in these stones, only arrangement. Bodies lay as they had been positioned by water and gravity, their final orientation fixed by the sediment that enclosed them. The land did not shout its history. It absorbed it, holding details precisely where they belonged. Over time, minerals replaced organic matter, and pressure transformed loose layers into rock. The memory of drowning became part of the Earth's structure. Fossils lay not as isolated relics, but as components of a larger pattern, embedded within flood-borne deposits that extended across wide regions. In this way, the ground remembered what the surface no longer showed. Beneath plains, hills, and cities, stone carried the quiet account of water overwhelming land. The fossil record preserved not only the end of individual lives, but the motion that delivered them there, sealed into layers that still speak without sound. Far from any ancient shoreline, the ocean floor preserved its own account of that time. Beneath layers of later sediment, evidence gathered quietly where the sea had once been deepest. These records did not belong to land, yet they carried unmistakable traces of it, pressed into marine deposits with a precision that only sudden transport could achieve. Within sediments formed under open water, the remains of terrestrial animals appeared where they did not belong. Fragments of bone, teeth, and plant matter rested among shells and deep-sea minerals, carried far from their original environments and released into the quiet depths. These remains were not scattered randomly. They occurred in discrete layers, concentrated and abrupt, marking moments when the boundary between worlds briefly dissolved. The composition of those layers revealed further detail. Fine marine sediments mixed directly with material formed under intense pressure, containing minerals altered by extreme force. Shocked grains appeared alongside seafloor deposits, their internal structures bearing the mark of sudden compression. These layers were thin but widespread, extending across vast areas of the ocean basin. They did not build slowly. They arrived as part of a single episode of rearrangement, when energy crossed from land to sea without pause. This mingling of signatures told a clear story. Materials shaped by impact on land became entangled with sediments settling through water, evidence that the processes affecting continents did not end at the shore. Rock, dust, and organic fragments moved together through connected systems, settling wherever gravity finally slowed them. The ocean floor became a receiving surface for a planet-wide exchange, recording the moment when separation between environments ceased to function. What made this marine testimony remarkable was its composure. In the deep ocean, deposition followed its usual rules once material arrived. Particles drifted downward through water columns and settled in orderly layers, even if their origins were violent. The sea did not churn these materials indefinitely. It accepted them, arranged them, and preserved them with care. Chaos above translated into calm geometry below. Over time, pressure transformed these layers into stone. The shock-altered minerals hardened alongside undisturbed marine sediments, locking contrast into place. Fossils of land creatures lay sealed within ocean rock, not disturbed by currents or scavengers. Their presence required no dramatic explanation once seen. Water had carried them, and gravity had placed them. These deposits confirmed that the catastrophe was not confined to a single realm. Land and sea interacted directly, exchanging matter in ways that normal processes never allowed. The ocean floor bore witness not through upheaval, but through inclusion. It recorded what fell into it without judgment, preserving signs of collision in layers that remained stable for millions of years. In this way, The deep sea remembered what the surface erased. Where waves and movement faded, stone endured. The marine record held proof that the boundaries defining Earth's systems had momentarily failed, and in their absence, the planet wrote a shared history across land and ocean alike. Light did not vanish all at once, it thinned. As fine material lingered high in the atmosphere, the brightness of day softened into a muted glow, and the planet entered a season of dimness that arrived while water still occupied the land. Above, the sky grew heavy with suspended particles. Below, flooded terrain remained unsettled, holding water that had not yet found release. These two changes overlapped, not sequentially, binding the surface of the Earth into a single extended response. As temperatures began to fall, precipitation shifted in character. Rain arrived colder, steadier, and more persistent, drawn from air that no longer circulated freely. Instead of brief storms, long periods of drizzle and downpour settled over already saturated ground. Water falling from above met water that had never left, increasing volume without restoring movement. Runoff expanded across slopes and plains, collecting fine material loosened by earlier disturbance and carrying it outward once more. Erosion accelerated under these conditions. Cooler temperatures reduced vegetation growth and slowed recovery, leaving soil exposed beneath shallow water and weak currents. Raindrops struck bare surfaces and loosened particles that no roots held in place. Streams widened into sheets, banks dissolved gradually, feeding sediment into basins and lowlands that were already burdened. Each rainfall altered the surface slightly, deepening channels, smoothing contours, and extending flooded zones beyond their earlier margins. This erosion did not produce dramatic collapse. It worked continuously, shaving material away and redistributing it across the landscape. Hills softened, valleys filled. Features that once guided drainage lost definition as water spread laterally rather than concentrating into channels. The landscape's ability to direct flow diminished further, reinforcing the persistence of flooding. Water lingered not through force, but through lack of structure. Meanwhile, the cooling atmosphere slowed evaporation. With less energy reaching the surface, water returned to the air more slowly than it fell back again. Flooded areas retained their volume, even as movement within them became more limited. Shallow inland waters darkened as sediment accumulated and organic matter broke down. The contrast between sky and ground sharpened, dim above and heavy below, locking the surface into a prolonged state of saturation. Flooding persisted as temperatures continued their downward trend. The absence of warmth did not bring relief. Instead, it prolonged imbalance. Ice did not yet dominate, but cold constrained the processes that might otherwise have restored circulation. Microbial activity slowed in some regions and intensified in others, depending on chemistry and depth. The surface entered a suspended condition, neither actively reshaping nor returning to stability. In this phase, cause and effect became difficult to separate. Darkness altered rainfall. Rainfall altered erosion. Erosion altered drainage. Drainage failure preserved flooding. Each element reinforced the others, without urgency or pause. The Earth did not pivot sharply from one state to the next. It layered responses gently, allowing them to coexist. The result was a world where change continued quietly. Above, light remained thin and distant. Below, water endured, reshaping land grain by grain while temperatures fell. Extinction advanced not through a single overwhelming pressure, but through the accumulation of conditions that refused to resolve, holding the planet in a long, dim passage where recovery never quite began. The problem became not how water arrived, but how it might ever leave. As movement slowed and temperatures fell, the planet revealed a deeper constraint embedded within its structure. Pathways that once carried excess water away no longer functioned as they had. Channels clogged, slopes softened, depressions deepened under accumulated weight. The surface lost its ability to guide flow with clarity, and the Earth entered a condition where imbalance sustained itself. Across continents, waterways failed quietly. Rivers burdened with sediment could no longer cut efficient channels. Their beds rose as material settled, reducing gradient and slowing discharge. In places, banks collapsed inward, choking passages that had once remained open through seasonal change. What water still moved did so reluctantly, spreading outward instead of concentrating into escape routes. Drainage shifted from directional to diffuse, favoring stagnation over release. Terrain collapse compounded the issue. Saturated ground lost coherence, especially where underlying structures had been weakened by earlier disturbance. Subtle subsidence altered elevation just enough to reverse local gradients. Areas that once drained became basins. Shallow valleys flattened, removing the slope required for movement. These changes did not announce themselves dramatically. They accumulated quietly, transforming functional landscapes into surfaces that held water by default. Normal drainage systems depend on contrast, high ground feeding lower channels that guide water efficiently toward the sea. That contrast faded. With hills softened and channels raised, the difference between source and outlet diminished. Water lingered where it fell or flowed, pooling in newly formed depressions that linked together across low regions. Instead of networks, the land supported patches of retention, each one slowing the whole. At the same time, sea levels remained persistently high. The redistribution of water across ocean basins did not resolve quickly, and the volume resting on continental margins continued to exceed earlier norms. High seas reduced the gradient at river mouths, backing water up rather than drawing it outward. Inland flow encountered resistance at the edges, further discouraging drainage. The boundary between land and ocean held steady in its expanded state. Evaporation offered little correction. Cooler temperatures limited the return of water to the atmosphere, slowing one of the planet's primary balancing processes. Precipitation, though reduced over time, continued to arrive faster than the surface could release what it already held. Each addition reinforced saturation, locking conditions into place. This combination prevented equilibrium from reestablishing. The Earth did not lack mechanisms for balance, but those mechanisms relied on structure that had been altered. Drainage required pathways that no longer existed in useful form. Relief depended on gradients that had been flattened. The planet carried excess water without a clear means to redistribute it effectively. What followed was not motion, but endurance. Flooded regions remained flooded, inland seas persisted, soil stayed waterlogged. Recovery, when it came, would require long periods of slow adjustment as erosion, sediment transport, and gradual uplift restored functional differences across the surface. For a time, however, the Earth remained unable to drain itself. Water occupied the land not because of continued force, but because the geometry of the planet no longer favored release. The surface held its imbalance gently, prolonging conditions that extended extinction beyond the initial catastrophe and into the deeper rhythm of geological time. Survival did not always belong to the strongest or the largest. As water reshaped the surface of the earth, it favored traits that had once seemed modest, even insignificant. In a world where stability vanished, Those advantages began to matter more than size or strength. Small bodies moved differently through altered terrain. They required less space, less energy, and fewer resources to persist. Small animals could navigate environments that larger ones could not. Shallow flooding that exhausted heavy bodies remained passable to lighter forms. Narrow passages between debris, vegetation, and uneven ground offered routes that mass could not exploit. When water shifted suddenly, small creatures adjusted quickly, changing direction or retreating without the burden of momentum working against them. Their movements left fewer traces and required fewer commitments. Burrowing became one of the most effective responses. Beneath the surface, conditions were often more stable than above it. Soil insulated against temperature swings and buffered the force of moving water. Many small animals already possessed the ability to dig or occupy existing tunnels, roots, and cavities. These spaces provided temporary refuge during surges and protection from debris carried by floodwaters. Even shallow burrows reduced exposure and conserved energy when movement above ground became costly. Hiding also played a role. Crevices, fallen vegetation, and floating mats of organic material created pockets of shelter across flooded landscapes. Small animals could occupy these spaces without displacing them. Remaining still became a strategy rather than a weakness. While larger species depended on range and access, smaller ones endured by minimizing interaction with an unstable environment. Early mammals benefited from a combination of these traits. Their size allowed them to exploit shelter. Their diets were flexible, often centered on insects, seeds, or scavenged material that remained available even as plant communities collapsed. Many were nocturnal or crepuscular, accustomed to navigating limited visibility. When flooding obscured landmarks and altered light, these habits offered quiet continuity rather than disruption. Movement through flooded terrain demanded adaptability more than endurance. Early mammals climbed when needed, swam briefly when required, and returned to cover without prolonged exposure. They did not dominate space, they negotiated it. This approach reduced risk in a landscape where conditions changed repeatedly and without warning. Survival depended on responding to what remained rather than controlling what was lost. Adaptability replaced dominance as the defining measure of success. The ability to alter behavior quickly mattered more than specialized strength. Flexible reproduction, short generation times, and varied diets allowed populations to persist even as environments shifted around them. While larger species struggled to meet their needs within narrowing margins, smaller ones adjusted expectations and continued. This contrast reshaped the future long before it became visible. Survival through water did not require mastery over the environment. It required tolerance, restraint, and the capacity to endure uncertainty. In the flooded world that followed the impact, these quieter qualities carried life forward, laying the foundation for what would come next without announcing it at the time. Long before fire altered the surface, plants began to disappear in quieter ways. Forests that had grown in balance with seasonal flooding were not prepared for water that remained without release. Roots depended on cycles of saturation and exposure, on soil that could breathe between wet periods. When water lingered, oxygen vanished from the ground, and the living systems beneath the surface failed first. Trees did not fall immediately. Leaves dulled and growth slowed as roots suffocated below. Without oxygen, cells responsible for nutrient transport weakened, and the connection between soil and canopy thinned. Even sturdy trunks became irrelevant once the underground network collapsed. Entire forests remained standing while life drained out of them, their silhouettes intact above water that quietly undermined them below. As vegetation died, soil systems followed. Roots that once held sediment in place decayed, loosening the structure of the ground. Fine particles suspended easily, turning stable earth into drifting material that water carried away. Organic layers built over centuries dispersed in weeks, stripping the land of the microbial communities that sustained fertility. The ground lost memory of its former texture, becoming uniform, dense, and unresponsive. Seeds fared no better. Many relied on shallow burial and timed exposure to germinate. Floodwaters carried them deeper, packing them beneath layers of sediment beyond the reach of light and temperature change. Others remained afloat briefly before settling into stagnant pools where decay began quickly. Seed banks that should have ensured regeneration were erased without ever sprouting. The future of the forest vanished underground. This loss unfolded without spectacle. There were no flames, no collapse, no sudden clearing. Vegetation died, standing or submerged, its remains adding organic matter to waterlogged soils that could not process it efficiently. Decomposition slowed in oxygen-poor conditions, creating layers of plant debris that further sealed the ground. Each death made recovery less likely, not through destruction, but through accumulation. As plant life faded, ecosystems unraveled at their foundation. Without living vegetation, surfaces absorbed more water and reflected less energy, reinforcing saturation and cooling. Nutrient cycles halted. Fungal networks broke apart. Insects lost host plants and vanished alongside them. The absence of growth removed the first step of every terrestrial food chain, leaving higher life unsupported even where animals still endured. What distinguished this botanical collapse was its silence. No single moment marked the end. Forests did not burn or blow down immediately. They ceased to function. Reproduction stopped. Growth paused and never resumed. Landscapes that had appeared unchanged from a distance were already empty at a biological level, their green surfaces masking systemic failure beneath. This quiet loss preceded later devastation. When fire finally arrived in some regions, much of what it consumed was already dead. The living world of plants had ended earlier, drowned by still water and sealed soil. Ecosystems collapsed, not in a blaze, but in a hush, as the base of life slipped away unseen, leaving the land unable to rebuild when conditions finally shifted again. The shallow seas sat between worlds, neither fully ocean nor fully land, and in doing so, they joined what might otherwise have failed separately. These broad, warm waters occupied the margins of continents, spreading thinly across shelves where light still reached the bottom. They supported marine life while touching terrestrial systems constantly, sharing sediments, nutrients, and temperature with the land beside them. In this arrangement, extinction did not remain confined to a single realm. Stress arriving in the oceans passed easily into the continents, and stress on land returned just as readily to the sea. Flooding altered coastlines, but it also diluted coastal waters, disrupted salinity, and shifted chemistry across shallow basins. Marine communities that depended on stable conditions near shore declined alongside terrestrial ecosystems already weakened by saturation and erosion. The overlap became unavoidable because shallow seas acted as conduits rather than barriers. Rivers delivered sediment and organic matter into them, and flooding reversed that flow, carrying marine water and material inland. Life on either side depended on cycles that crossed this boundary daily. When one side failed, the other followed. Food webs connected across shorelines unraveled together, not in sequence, but in parallel. Water linked every stage of the disaster without pause. It carried energy from impact into motion, motion into flooding, flooding into stagnation, and stagnation into biological collapse. Fire and darkness altered conditions from above, yet water governed what happened at the surface and below it. It spread consequences evenly, ignoring distinctions between environments that life had relied upon for refuge. The Earth behaved as a single connected system throughout this period. Processes in the deep ocean influenced coastlines. Changes along coastlines reshaped continental interiors. Atmospheric shifts altered precipitation, which reinforced flooding already underway. No process operated in isolation long enough to spare one region while another failed. The planet responded as a whole, its components exchanging pressure until imbalance reached everywhere. This unity removed the possibility of sanctuary. Movement away from water led eventually back to it. Higher ground offered only temporary separation before drainage failed and water collected again. The sea, once thought distant from interior life, extended influence through chemistry, temperature, and circulation. Even areas that avoided direct inundation depended on systems already compromised elsewhere. Marine extinctions mirrored terrestrial losses because their foundations were shared. Shallow seas warmed and cooled rapidly, accumulated sediment, and lost oxygen as stagnation set in. These same conditions echoed inland, shaped by the same drivers. Creatures adapted to one realm found little advantage when the supporting system beneath both collapsed. In this way, extinction became systemic rather than selective. It did not move outward from a center, it spread through connections already present. The shallow seas revealed this truth by existing between domains, touching all of them without belonging fully to any. They ensured that no border could hold. When the dinosaur world faded, it did so without a single front line. Water bound the planet together, carrying change everywhere it reached. With Earth acting as one continuous system, there was no true refuge left to find. Time stretched differently once the waters spread. While the first disturbances arrived within hours and days, the retreat unfolded on a far slower scale. Geological records, preserved in sediment thickness, erosion patterns, and mineral transitions, suggest that flooding did not resolve quickly. In many regions, elevated water conditions persisted long after other dramatic forces had faded from the surface. Firestorms burned intensely but briefly, ash settled, skies darkened and later cleared. By contrast, water remained. Flooded basins and interior seas endured across extended spans of time, measured not in seasons but in many thousands of years. The planet did not simply drain once heat dissipated. The mechanisms required for release had been altered, and recovery proceeded at the pace of geology rather than catastrophe. Stratified sediments provide quiet markers of this duration. Thick, laterally continuous layers reveal slow deposition in standing or weakly moving water. Between them, signs of soil formation or vegetation return are often absent, indicating long intervals when land stayed submerged or saturated. These records suggest that flooding outlasted the most visible phases of destruction, continuing while climates cooled and ecosystems attempted uncertain adjustment. The oceans themselves withdrew reluctantly. Sea levels remained high as water redistributed slowly across basins, reshaped by impact and erosion. Continental margins adjusted over extended periods, their slopes and shelves settling into new configurations that guided retreat unevenly. In some areas, shorelines moved seaward only gradually, pausing or reversing with subtle shifts in balance. Inland seas lingered longest, held in place by minimal gradient and persistent saturation. As the oceans retreated, they did not return the world to its former outline. The land that emerged was altered, its surfaces smoothed, its channels redefined, its soils stripped or buried, valleys filled that had once drained efficiently. Plains reappeared at different elevations. The geography that followed bore little resemblance to what had existed before, even where water finally receded. Recovery, where it occurred, unfolded slowly. New river systems established themselves cautiously, cutting fresh paths through reworked sediment. Vegetation returned unevenly, favoring stable ground and avoiding regions that remained waterlogged. The planet took its time, rediscovering equilibrium, guided by erosion, uplift, and long-term climate adjustment rather than rapid correction. In this drawn-out retreat, the scale of flooding became clear. It was not a brief interruption layered onto extinction. It was a sustained condition that shaped what followed. The disappearance of dinosaurs did not happen against a backdrop of quickly passing water. It occurred on a planet that stayed wet, unstable, and unresolved far beyond the moment of impact. By the time the seas finally settled into new boundaries, the world had been reshaped. The duration of flooding ensured that extinction was reinforced, not merely triggered. What remained was a different Earth, altered quietly over time, carrying forward the imprint of water that lingered long after fire and darkness had faded. The land reemerged slowly, and when it did, it no longer resembled the world that had disappeared beneath the water. As levels lowered and shallow seas withdrew from the interior, surfaces were revealed that felt unfamiliar even to the planet itself. Slopes appeared where plains had been, broad flats emerged where forests once stood. The outlines of the continents remained, but their details had been softened, rearranged, and stripped of memory. What lay exposed was coated in sediment, thick blankets of sand, silt, and clay stretched across vast areas, smoothing the landscape into muted tones and gentle contours. These layers were not evenly distributed. Some regions bore deep deposits that filled valleys and buried former river courses. Others showed thinner coverings that still erased surface detail. The ground had been resurfaced, as if the planet had laid down a new skin over what remained beneath. This sediment muted everything. Rocks protruded only where erosion had begun its slow work again. Soil structure was absent or fragile, lacking the complexity built by long-living systems. Without roots to anchor it, the surface shifted easily under the influence of gravity and light rain. The land did not yet behave like land. It waited, inert and unresolved. Across these newly exposed expanses, life was notably absent. Mile after mile stretched outward with little variation, uninterrupted by growth or movement. What vegetation survived elsewhere had not yet returned to claim this ground. The surface reflected light differently, pale and uniform, with no canopy to break the view. The scale of emptiness became apparent only when nothing interrupted it. The silence was profound. During flooding, the world had been defined by motion, water advancing and retreating, sediment settling, currents shifting. Now that movement had withdrawn, sound followed. There were no leaves to stir, no animal steps, no flowing water to shape rhythm. Wind passed over exposed surfaces without resistance, carrying nothing with it. The planet entered a quieter phase, one defined not by action, but by stillness. This stillness was not peaceful in the way forests once were. It carried no complexity, no interaction. It was simply absence. The processes that would one day rebuild texture and diversity had not yet begun in earnest. Erosion moved slowly. Chemical weathering worked without urgency. The land remained bare long enough for its emptiness to settle in. In places, shallow channels hinted at where water had once flowed, but they led nowhere yet. Drainage paths were tentative, easily altered by small changes in slope or debris. The landscape had lost its confidence. It offered no guidance to movement, no clear destinations, only gradual surfaces awaiting reshaping over time. This was the moment when water released its hold, but did not restore what it had taken. The retreat revealed a world paused between destruction and renewal. Motion had ended, and what replaced it was quiet continuity. The earth had completed one chapter of change, and now rested, holding a surface that would define the limits and possibilities of all life that followed. The dinosaur world did not vanish in a single moment, it thinned. As the planet settled into its altered state, life faded unevenly across regions and lineages, shaped by pressures that persisted rather than peaked. What had once been a crowded and varied biosphere gradually lost its density, its diversity, narrowing as time advanced without relief. Different species disappeared at different rates. Some vanished early, tied closely to environments that failed quickly once flooding and saturation took hold. Others endured longer, retreating into shrinking habitats that still offered fragments of what they required. The fossil record preserves this staggered decline as gaps rather than a clean boundary, a drawn-out absence that unfolded across layers rather than at a single line. Flooding acted as a sustained pressure rather than a decisive blow. Even where water no longer advanced, its effects remained embedded in soil, drainage, and food availability. Landscapes could not support previous population sizes. Breeding slowed, juvenile survival dropped, migration routes fractured. Each generation faced slightly worse conditions than the last, not through catastrophe, but through diminished opportunity. This pressure worked quietly. Dinosaurs did not need to die in vast numbers at once for extinction to progress. It was enough that replacement failed. Fewer eggs hatched, fewer young reached maturity. Ranges contracted incrementally as flooded or unstable ground limited access to resources. Over time, populations slipped below levels needed to recover from routine losses. Some species lingered in pockets that remained marginally stable. These refuges were temporary by nature, dependent on fragile balances that flooding had already compromised. When conditions shifted again, even subtly, these last holdouts failed. The disappearance was not dramatic, it was final. Extinction here behaved like erosion. No single force could be isolated as the cause at every moment. Instead, processes worked together to remove viability bit by bit. Flooding reshaped land. Stagnation altered chemistry. Erosion erased structure. Each change removed options until survival narrowed to nothing. The loss accumulated invisibly until it crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. What endured longest were not necessarily the most powerful or specialized forms. Longevity favored those with broader tolerance, yet even adaptability met limits within an environment that refused to stabilize. The sustained nature of the pressure ensured that advantages eroded alongside disadvantages, leaving no lineage untouched forever. By the time the last dinosaurs disappeared, the world they had known no longer existed. The extinction marked not an ending imposed suddenly from above, but a conclusion reached gradually as conditions failed to support continuity. The planet did not remove life by force alone. It altered the terms of existence until persistence was no longer possible. In this way, the end of the dinosaur world arrived softly in time, though its consequences were absolute. Extinction unfolded as a process rather than an event, shaped by the long presence of water and the slow reshaping of Earth itself, until an entire age receded beyond recovery. Stories often favor what announces itself loudly. Fire leaves scars that can be traced easily. Impact fractures rock, scatters debris, and marks time with a single, unmistakable boundary. These elements shape the earliest understanding of the dinosaur extinction because they were dramatic, visible, and concise. They fit cleanly into a narrative that began with violence and ended abruptly. Flooding told a different kind of story. It did not leave a single line to follow across continents. Its signatures were dispersed, layered, and easily mistaken for ordinary processes repeated over time. Water rearranged landscapes without shattering them, depositing material gently even when the force behind it was immense. What it left behind blended into the background of deep time, its traces subtle enough to be overlooked when louder explanations were already in place. The imagination lingered on fire because it aligned with spectacle. The idea of an instant end appealed to clarity and scale. Flooding, by contrast, complicated the picture. It suggested duration rather than moment, pressure rather than blow. Its evidence required patience to interpret. Sediment layers had to be read in sequence. Transport had to be inferred from direction and composition. These were quieter signals, easy to miss when expectations leaned elsewhere. Geology itself reveals truth slowly. It does not offer conclusions immediately. Understanding emerges through accumulation, comparison, and reinterpretation as new tools refine old assumptions. Early studies focused on what could be dated precisely and seen clearly. As techniques improved and data sets expanded, patterns once dismissed as local anomalies began to align across regions. What seemed isolated gained coherence. Flooding evidence often appeared fragmented because it was fragmented by nature. Inland marine sediments, reversed flow indicators, and mass burial deposits were studied in isolation before they were understood as parts of a single system. Each spoke softly on its own. Together, they formed a consistent narrative that required stepping back from familiar frameworks. Science moves forward by revisiting what it thought it understood. As more records accumulated and models grew more integrated, the role of water became harder to ignore. Connections between land and sea strengthened. The idea of Earth responding as a coupled system gained support. Flooding shifted from being a peripheral consequence to a central mechanism shaping extinction. This shift did not replace earlier explanations. It refined them. Fire and darkness remained important, but they no longer carried the story alone. The planet's response proved more complex, unfolding through processes that interacted across time and space. Recognizing flooding required letting go of simplicity in favor of continuity. Earth remembers everything, but it does not repeat itself clearly. Its memory is layered, compressed, and altered by what comes after. Reading that memory demands time and restraint. Only recently has science slowed enough to notice what water recorded so patiently. This part of the story was overlooked not because it lacked evidence, but because its evidence asked to be listened to differently. As understanding deepens, the quiet chapters emerge. What once hid beneath assumption becomes visible, and the planet's fuller account begins to take shape. Across deep time, flooding appears not as an anomaly, but as a capacity the planet carries within itself. Water responds to imbalance with consistency, redistributing mass until new arrangements emerge. This ability does not belong to a single moment in history. It surfaces repeatedly whenever conditions align to favor wide-scale movement and prolonged saturation. The Earth does not invent new methods for change each time. It relies on the same quiet mechanisms again and again. Earlier mass extinctions reveal similar patterns. Long before the dinosaur world ended, water played a central role in reshaping life's boundaries. Rising seas during past crises spread across continents, drowning shallow ecosystems and altering chemistry far from coastlines. In those events, flooding unfolded over extended periods, linked to shifts in climate, tectonics, or atmospheric composition. The details differed, but the structure remained familiar. Water expanded, lingered, and transformed environments beyond recovery. These comparisons suggest that flooding functions as a planetary reset rather than a localized disaster. It operates through connection, linking oceans, atmosphere, and land into a single response. When pressures accumulate, water becomes the medium through which the planet releases and redistributes energy. Fire may arrive suddenly, ice may advance slowly, but water bridges these extremes, capable of both rapid movement and long persistence. Water also occupies a unique position as both creator and destroyer. It carves valleys, builds deltas, and sustains life across nearly every surface it touches. At the same time, it erases boundaries, suffocates systems, and dissolves stability when balance is lost. These opposing roles coexist without contradiction. Creation and destruction are not separate tools. They are expressions of the same process, viewed at different scales and times. Life flourishes under water's steady presence, but struggles under its excess. When water remains where it should move, or moves where it should rest, the conditions that support complexity falter. Oxygen declines, nutrients disperse unpredictably, structure dissolves. The systems that rely on gradual exchange fail under sustained inundation. Extinction follows not through aggression, but through incompatibility. This pattern reveals something essential about the planet's character. Earth does not act with intention toward life. It responds to physical forces alone, adjusting mass and energy until equilibrium is approached. Life benefits when those adjustments occur within tolerable bounds. It suffers when they do not. Flooding becomes lethal not because it targets organisms, but because organisms exist within limits that water does not acknowledge. The idea of Earth drowning itself is not metaphorical. It reflects the capacity of the planet to submerge large portions of its surface as part of normal geophysical behavior. When this occurs, extinction becomes a consequence of scale rather than malice. The planet continues its cycles, indifferent to what is lost along the way. Understanding this does not diminish the tragedy of past extinctions. It reframes them within a broader context. The dinosaur world ended not because Earth turned hostile, but because Earth continued doing what it has always done. Water moved, balance shifted, and life adjusted until it could not. In that continuity lies both the fragility of living systems and the enduring neutrality of the planet that hosts them. The planet did not recover with urgency. After the long disturbances had passed, what followed was not renewal in motion, but a slowing of everything that had once surged and collapsed. Water settled first. The oceans eased into new outlines, shaped by altered shelves and softened margins. Their boundaries no longer matched memory, yet they became consistent, holding position without advancing or retreating with force. Waves continued, but without excess. Currents resumed familiar paths, guided by basins reshaped through erosion and deposition. Tides rose and fell against shores that had not existed before, gently testing their stability. The sea no longer pressed inland. It rested, distributing energy quietly across its surface and depths. On land, motion diminished. Sediment stopped shifting in sheets and began to settle into place. Slopes stabilized enough to resist collapse. Drainage became tentative but persistent, carving shallow paths that would, over time, grow more defined. The planet entered a phase of waiting, not passive, but restrained, as if allowing its systems to find balance without interference. This interval left little record of drama. In rock layers, it appears as uniformity, broad expanses of similar material laid down slowly. Change continued, but at a pace measured in small increments rather than sweeping transformation. The violence that had once dominated Earth's surface gave way to continuity, and continuity to silence. That silence endured. Without large animals to reshape terrain, and without dense forests to anchor soil, landscapes remained open and sparse. Chemical processes worked patiently, altering minerals grain by grain. Weather passed over the surface without urgency. Seasons returned to rhythm, but the world they moved through was empty enough that their passage left minimal trace. Within this quiet, life began again, but without announcement, small organisms took hold first, favoring sheltered environments where moisture and stability persisted. Growth was limited and localized, constrained by thin soils and uncertain drainage. Yet, persistence mattered more than scale. Each surviving lineage occupied space cautiously, expanding only where conditions allowed. The return of complexity took far longer than its loss. Ecosystems assembled slowly from fragments, guided by chance dispersal and gradual adaptation. No single moment marked their beginning. Instead, layers accumulated evidence of life's return through subtle changes in chemistry and structure. Carbon reappeared in small concentrations. Roots left faint impressions. Burrows disturbed sediment only slightly. The planet did not celebrate this recovery. It offered no restoration of what had been. It simply permitted life to resume where physics allowed it. Oceans remained deep and vast. Continents stayed altered. The silence did not vanish, but softened as activity increased imperceptibly. This was how Earth learned to be quiet again, not through absence of change, but through the absence of urgency. The catastrophe ended not with renewal, but with restraint. Over immense spans of time, that restraint proved sufficient. From stillness emerged continuity, and from continuity, the slow rebuilding of a living world that bore little resemblance to the one that had ended. In that calm, the planet continued forward, unchanged in its nature, yet carrying the subtle imprint of everything it had allowed to pass. Life returned cautiously, shaped by the surfaces the floods had left behind. The ground that emerged from retreating waters carried a different character than before, layered with sediments that altered drainage, soil chemistry, and stability. These deposits became the foundation of new ecosystems, not replicas of what had been lost, but arrangements adapted to a reshaped planet. Where forests once anchored deep soils, thinner substrates now supported hardy pioneers that tolerated saturation and disturbance. Vegetation assembled unevenly across this altered terrain. In some regions, plants took advantage of nutrient-rich sediments laid down by prolonged inundation. Elsewhere, recovery remained slow, limited by compacted layers that resisted roots and retained water too long. These contrasts created mosaics of growth and openness, patchwork landscapes that favored flexibility over dominance. Ecosystems developed without continuity to the past, Guided by opportunity rather than inheritance, mammals entered this world already in motion. They did not rise suddenly, nor did they replace dinosaurs by force. They expanded into spaces left available by absence. The altered terrain favored smaller bodies, burrowing habits, and adaptable diets. Flood-shaped landscapes offered shelter and fragmentation, conditions that rewarded caution and versatility. Mammals inherited a planet that no longer supported giants easily, and their forms reflected that constraint. Movement across land followed new rules. Waterlogged histories had disrupted corridors and erased long-standing routes. Rivers cut differently. Plains drained unevenly. Migration became localized rather than expansive. Mammals navigated this world through proximity and shelter, often remaining close to cover. Their success was not rooted in strength, but in persistence within unstable environments. Evolution carried the imprint of flooding forward. Traits that supported survival in saturated soils and unpredictable climates persisted. Flexibility in reproduction, diet, and habitat use became common. Lineages that endured were those capable of adjusting to ground that shifted seasonally and resources that fluctuated without warning. The memory of water remained embedded in selection pressures long after surfaces dried. Over time, complexity increased again, but it followed new pathways. Ecosystems layered themselves cautiously, building upward and outward from humble foundations. Forests eventually returned in some regions, yet they were different in composition and structure. Wetlands expanded where drainage never fully recovered. The boundaries between land and water stayed blurred, continuing to influence life long after flooding ceased. This long legacy reached beyond immediate recovery. The flood shaped not only who survived, but how life organized itself afterward. Evolution unfolded on a planet where stability was no longer assumed. Every expansion carried memory of loss, encoded in landscape and biology alike. The world that followed was quieter in scale, but richer in adaptability. What replaced the dinosaur world was not an echo, but a response. New ecosystems grew from sediments laid down during catastrophe. Mammals inherited a terrain molded by water and absence. The future of life unfolded within those constraints, shaped by a history that could not be undone. The flood did not merely end an age. It defined what could come next, guiding evolution gently, persistently, and for the remainder of deep time. The surface of the modern world conceals far more than it reveals. Beneath soil, pavement, and cultivated fields lie layered records of landscapes that once moved, flooded, and vanished. These traces are not distant or abstract. They rest directly below where people walk, farm, and build, separated from the present by depth rather than distance. Ancient flood layers form part of this hidden foundation. Sheets of sediment deposited rapidly now appear as distinct bands within bedrock and subsurface cores. They differ from slow accumulating soils, compressed and uniform, carrying signatures of swift transport and widespread inundation. Grain size shifts abruptly. Marine minerals appear where none should exist. These layers do not announce catastrophe openly, but they persist quietly, marking moments when water reshaped continents. Within these deposits lie the remains of dinosaurs themselves. Skeletons rest beneath cities, forests, and agricultural land, preserved in the same sediments that buried their world. Bones remain aligned as they fell, sometimes clustered together, sometimes isolated, but rarely scattered by scavengers. Their positions suggest rapid burial, followed by long stillness, conditions created not by fire or drought, but by water and sediment settling together. Modern landscapes often mask these remains completely. Urban centers rise atop ancient floodplains. Highways cross what were once shallow seas. Fields spread over terrain that experienced repeated saturation long before human history began. The ground feels stable now, yet its deeper layers recall a different state, one defined by motion and collapse. Coastlines also conceal these older stories. Many modern shores follow outlines that have shifted repeatedly, advancing and retreating over millions of years. Beneath beaches and coastal plains are stacked records of older coastlines, each marking a former balance between land and sea. Some of these layers correspond to quiet periods. Others preserve evidence of sudden submergence and retreat, moments when water erased familiar boundaries. These buried coastlines hide the memory of disasters that no longer shape the surface directly. Erosion smooths them, deposition covers them. Only careful excavation or subsurface imaging reveals their presence. What appears stable today rests atop a landscape that once failed abruptly under stress. Deep time resides just below the surface, compressed into layers thinner than expected. A few meters can separate centuries from millions of years. Within that narrow vertical space, entire worlds are recorded, including the flood that ended the dinosaur age. The planet carries these records without emphasis, preserving them without commentary. Walking across modern ground means crossing the quiet aftermath of ancient change. Beneath every step lies evidence of a world that drowned, settled, and was replaced. The passage from then to now is continuous, uninterrupted by awareness. Earth does not erase its past, it buries it carefully, allowing later worlds to form above. These traces remind us that the planet beneath us has failed before, not violently, but completely. The surface we recognize is temporary. Below it rests a deeper memory, one that records how easily stability can be reshaped and how close the distant past remains, waiting silently beneath the present. Change on a planetary scale rarely announces itself all at once. The Earth tends toward gradualism, even when triggered by sudden events. What follows is seldom a clean break. It is a wearing down, a reshaping carried out through countless small adjustments that accumulate until a threshold is crossed. Worlds end not with a single gesture, but through persistence. Extinction, seen this way, resembles erosion. Individual losses may be difficult to mark in isolation, yet together they carve absence into the record of life. Flooding, saturation, and displacement work quietly, removing options one layer at a time. Habitats thin, margins retreat. What once supported abundance becomes only barely viable, then insufficient. The process continues without urgency, but without pause. Drowning fits this pattern precisely. Across deep time, water has returned repeatedly as an agent of reduction. Seas rise and linger. Drainage fails. Oxygen declines. Life adjusts downward rather than outward. These are not moments of spectacle. They are intervals of constraint that persist until complexity cannot be maintained. The certainty of the outcome emerges only in retrospect, after enough time has passed for absence to become complete. This slow certainty defines planetary change. The Earth does not rush to equilibrium. It approaches balance through iteration, allowing conditions to persist long enough for their consequences to become permanent. What feels prolonged on a human timescale remains brief geologically. Thousands of years compress into thin layers. Entire lineages vanish within spans that barely register in the planet's memory. Perspective shifts when scale expands. What appears catastrophic from close range becomes methodical when viewed broadly. Water spreads, settles, recedes, and spreads again, guided by physics rather than intent. Life responds, adapts, contracts, and disappears, not because it is targeted, but because it occupies a narrowing space of possibility. The planet continues adjusting long after the last organism suited to former conditions has gone. Understanding extinction as erosion reframes its meaning. It removes the need for singular villains or moments. Instead, it emphasizes continuity. The same forces that build landscapes also dismantle them. The same water that sustains ecosystems eventually overwhelms them when balance shifts. These outcomes are not exceptions, they are expressions of how the Earth operates over time. From this distance, endings appear less abrupt and more inevitable. The dinosaur world did not fail because of a single instant, but because the planet entered a state that no longer supported it. Once that state persisted long enough, the conclusion followed naturally. What ended was not just a group of animals, but a configuration of conditions that could not be restored. The Earth does not end worlds quickly because it does not need to. Given time, imbalance resolves itself, change accumulates, absence grows, new forms wait their turn. Seen this way, extinction becomes part of a longer rhythm, one that continues quietly beneath every living moment, shaping the future even as it erases the past. Deep time carries a different kind of weight. It does not rush toward conclusions, nor does it pause for recognition. Within its scale, extinction appears less like an interruption and more like a condition that eventually arrives when circumstances remain unchanged for long enough. Life persists where it can, retreats where it must, and disappears where the planet no longer permits continuity. This pattern unfolds without drama, guided by duration rather than force. The dinosaur age ended within this quiet framework. While fire and darkness marked its beginning, they did not define its conclusion alone. Water completed what disruption began. It lingered, reshaped, and constrained until the conditions that once sustained giants no longer existed. The age faded not with a single end, but through a long narrowing of possibility as flooded landscapes refused to return to stability. This ending lacks intention. The planet did not act with purpose or judgment. It adjusted mass and energy according to physical rules, redistributing water until new balances formed. In doing so, it erased one configuration of life and allowed another to emerge later. The reshaping followed inevitability rather than choice, unfolding patiently as systems sought equilibrium. There is something unsettling in this neutrality. Earth does not distinguish between what is lost and what remains. It does not preserve eras out of reverence, nor does it hasten their passing. The same mechanisms that nurture complexity also dismantle it when conditions drift beyond tolerance. Extinction becomes an outcome of persistence rather than aggression. Yet within this realization lies a quiet kind of comfort. The planet continues. It carries forward without memory of preference, reshaping itself endlessly while life adapts to whatever surfaces emerge. The end of the dinosaur world did not halt Earth's story. It redirected it, creating space for futures that could not have existed before. Deep time teaches patience through scale. It compresses catastrophe into layers thin enough to hold beneath our feet, reminding us that permanence is a short-lived illusion. Oceans advance and retreat. Continents shift. Life appears, flourishes, and fades, all within rhythms too slow to feel and too vast to stop. The horror lies not in violence, but in certainty. Given enough time, imbalance resolves itself, even when resolution means removal. The flood that ended the dinosaur age was not an exception, but an expression of how the planet operates when conditions align. Water moved, land yielded, life adjusted until it could not. Still, the continuation of Earth offers perspective. From every ending, another configuration eventually forms. Recovery does not restore what was lost, but it allows what remains to explore new forms. The planet reshapes itself endlessly, indifferent yet reliable in its processes. In this way, deep time holds both loss and reassurance. Extinction is inevitable within its span, but so is renewal in unfamiliar shapes. The dinosaur age ended quietly, not erased, but absorbed into the planet's long memory. Earth moves on, carrying every past within its layers, continuing without pause, steady and unconcerned, long after each world has finished becoming what it was allowed to be.